Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Tom Andriola here from Office of the President. Welcome to this summer's town hall, UCIT Town Hall. Hope everyone's had a great start to their summer. We've got a great lineup for you today on today's call with an exciting speaker that we'll introduce in a few minutes. And we're trying something new today. Every time we do this, we try to advance how we're using the technology. So for the first time, we're doing the town hall actually from two locations. I'm going to hand off to our speaker, Dr. Lewis, who's in Santa Barbara, and we'll hope that technology all works. Let me walk through the agenda really quick before we turn it over to Dr. Lewis. So after a few opening comments from me, we're going to jump right into our esteemed speaker, who will talk about effective teaming. You will have an opportunity after her presentation to ask her questions directly. So be ready for that, and you'll be able to submit them through the chat function of Zoom or through the Slack channel. Either way, you'll be able to get questions, and we'll read them to Dr. Lewis. After that, I'll come back, and with the help of Matt Hall, the ITLC chair, we'll just talk really quickly, review again the ITLC priorities, talk about some of the progression around the UCIT community with a couple of success stories. And then we're hoping at about 5 minutes before the top of the hour, we'll open it up to just general Q&A from the community. So with that, I actually would like to get us going with our speaker today, Dr. Kyle Lewis. Kyle Lewis is professor and chair in technology management at UC Santa Barbara. She spent 15 years as a professor of management at University of Texas, Austin, and came to Santa Barbara in 2014. Dr. Lewis has degrees in computer science and mathematics from Duke, a master's from Carnegie Mellon, and a PhD in organizational behavior from the University of Maryland. She is most well known for her research on work team performance and innovation. And in addition to teaching courses on high performance teams and innovation, she has served as a software engineer, product manager, and strategist to technology ventures. So we are so pleased to have Dr. Lewis here with us today, and I'd like to turn it over to her in Santa Barbara to talk about team diversity and collective intelligence. Dr. Lewis, thank you so much for being with us today.
All right, thank you, Tom, for that nice introduction, and hello, all of you. It's great to be here. I wish I could see you in person, but I look forward to the questions that you have at the end of the talk. And today I'd like to talk about my own research and the research of my colleagues that may have a special resonance for those of you who work in teams, who work in technology. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. I've been studying teams for 25 years, and even though we've been studying teams for a very long time, there's still a lot we don't know and a lot that we are learning. So I'm happy to share about that with you today. So I mentioned we've been studying teams for 50 years in social psychology and in organizational behavior, and we study teams in real organizations perhaps like yours, and that has great fidelity when you study inside an organization, because we can very easily say that what we find in organizations is likely to translate to other organizations. We also study science and engineering teams, or really any teams for whom the type of exchange depends on expertise and knowledge. So certainly software teams would fall into this as well. And that's really how I got interested in teaming, was being on software teams and leading software teams. We've done a lot of research in military teams, and in fact, this is where a lot of the teams research started, because military teams, of course, have to coordinate, and the modern military is making that even more of an imperative. So the modern military often works in smaller groups who can't communicate necessarily loudly, but who have to coordinate their actions really perfectly in order to succeed and to stay safe. And finally, we study teams in medical settings. And medical settings are especially interesting because if you were to design teams such that they were most successful, you would never design them like surgical teams operate. And surgical teams operate, no pun intended there, but with small groups, and in a long surgery, you might have turnover of the team 2 or 3 times. And this type of turnover do to shift changes in this medical environment would be something that would really tank a lot of teams. So medical teams are working under circumstances where their team structures and their team processes are potentially problematic, where the outcomes are, of course, very, very important. Whereas if you're looking at organizational teams or even science teams, the performance outcomes, the dependent variables that we're interested in are high and low performance or on budget or not on budget. But in military teams and medical teams, of course, the stakes are much, much higher. And partly because of that, in medical teams, there's often tiny tweaks that make huge differences. One you might know about is using checklists. So there's a famous book called The Checklist Manifesto, and this describes a fairly simple intervention, very low cost, and that is to provide a checklist in the room before you start operating on the patient. Of course, all the members know what's on the checklist, but for some reason, having that checklist there matters, and fewer people die, and fewer people come back with infections, and fewer people have problems during surgeries. So I'd like you to keep in mind this idea of a checklist and this visual reminder. It does something to our brains, to our minds, that makes us perform better. And the work that you do and the work that I do is often done in teams. So technology teams are often looking for innovation, innovative outcomes, and teams are really more and more becoming the engine of that knowledge creation. And we know also that teams that are more diverse, with people with different perspectives, are actually more innovative. But teams aren't easy to work in or to study. You might think about them as complex systems of interacting parts. And when you change one part or one process, it affects the whole system. So this question about how changes in a team affect the whole team process, the team outcomes, and then the interventions that are likely to improve team performance are a little bit difficult to gain traction on. And that becomes even more so when you're managing teams of very diverse people. People who may not speak the same language, maybe they come from different disciplines, and they don't have common terminology that they both understand. These sorts of things make coordinating and collaborating more difficult. The good news is we have some great insights from our research and also great advice for managers and also team members working in these situations. So briefly, I wanted to show you how we study teams as academics. And I mentioned that we study teams in real organizations, and that you see at the top right of your screen. So the benefit of real organization studies is that you can say that the results are likely to generalize to similar types of organizations. The hard part about studying teams in real organizations is that you need lots of teams in order to get a big sample size to do your statistical analyses. And organizational teams tend to be very heterogeneous. They start at different times. They last different lengths. Their projects or their tasks are varying in their complexity. Team size may vary quite a bit. So you have to control for a lot of variables to really understand the interactions or the relationships that you're really interested in. For example, how does coordination affect team performance? So we overcome some of those problems in real teams by studying teams in the laboratory. And you see the little Lego model there on the left bottom part of your screen. It's kind of funny, but we do this a lot in laboratory research. We give teams a very clear-cut task. In this case, build a house, a pool, and a garage using Lego to certain specifications. And this gives us a lot of advantages that we don't have in organizational teams. All teams start at the same point. All teams have the same number of members. All teams are doing the same task. We hope they're doing it in different ways, so we get some variation. But a lot of the variables are controlled for in the lab, and that gives us a lot of confidence that the relationships we're interested in are more cleanly observed. And finally, we try to triangulate those two empirical approaches with computational modeling. because in both the lab and in the field, we have a problem of longitudinal work that we have a hard time capturing. So it's hard to spend hours, days, months inside of an organization learning about how a team evolves over time. And it's very difficult in the laboratory to get your human subjects to come back more than once, let alone 2, 3, or 4 times. You get a lot of attrition and you're left with not very much useful data. Computational modeling can take what we understand from the empirical research and take what we understand about our theories, model that using mathematics, formal mathematics, and then see what would happen over time. If our theories are correct, if our short-term empirics are correct, then what would that mean over a series of months or years? And the computational modeling and simulations allow us to observe what might happen over time, develop new hypotheses that then we can test in these other more real-world environments. So those 3 ways are ways that we can triangulate our results and feel more confident that what we're studying actually does generalize to the real world. You may know already what makes some teams great, what makes some teams work very badly. You probably have some things in mind. And some of you might think it's the members. Who you have on the team matters the most. Others might argue, no, it's not the members, it's what members actually do, more of a process-based argument. And still others would say, no, what matters most is the context. So the organizational culture, or the management team, or the degree to which the environment is changing technologically. Those sorts of things decide what makes a team great. And of course, it's probably all of those things. And we've studied almost every kind of variable that would fall into either or any of those. And obviously, I'm not going to be able to go over all those today, but there are 2 that I will talk about specifically today. One is the idea of intelligence. So the intelligence of a team. Can we say that one team is smarter than another? And also how you as leaders can help facilitate that collective intelligence that we're all seeking when we study and work in teams. Collective intelligence is something that's really inspired teams researchers. And I'll speak about a group of scholars who have been studying this for now almost a decade, Anita Woolley at Carnegie Mellon and Tom Malone at MIT. And they made the conjecture that, we observe collective intelligence in the natural world. Is there such a thing as collective intelligence at the group level among humans? And as I go through these examples of animal collective intelligence, I'm going to describe them in a way that maybe makes you recognize a certain type of team that you've performed in or have observed. So let's look at the ant colony. So ant colonies, they have very clear-cut goals, if you will, to create their shelter and to gather food, mostly for the queen. But there's one queen, and then there's lots of worker ants. And the worker ants are fungible, right? So it doesn't matter if, well, it matters to the ant who dies, but to everyone else, the death of one ant is not going to collapse the whole system. So this is a team where the agents, the individuals are fungible, replaceable. And this system works because there's always another ant to pick up the slack, if you will, when one of the members can't pursue the goal of the team. Another example would be a herd of sheep. And what you're looking at here is a massive herd trying to go through a small fence line. And this is an example of multiple agents, multiple individuals operating as one organism. So they are moving as one thing, and you can observe this on videos and in agent-based models very clearly how individual agents can operate as one. And in order to do that, the sheep must be so attentive to their neighbors such that they can't see the whole, the whole view or the whole vista in front of them. All they can see is that the sheep next to them twitches an ear or a muscle, wiggles. And that kind of movement is enough to move individuals so that they're following each other. So this is lots of individuals working as one organism. They can do it because they're extremely attentive to their neighbors. The meerkats at the bottom are adorable, but they also have some very good techniques for maintaining their family unit, and that's to prevent predators from attacking them. And in order to do this, they array themselves in a 360-degree form, so they're in a circle, so that every meerkat is looking at a different part of the savanna, making sure that any one of them can actually see a predator before it's on top of them. And this is an example of a team where you might say each member has a different job to do. Each member is focused on a different part of the savanna, but you need all of the members in order for the system to work well. If any one member doesn't hold up their end of the bargain, it isn't paying attention, then the system collapses, and in this case, the family may be consumed. And finally, the flock of geese is an interesting example. Here we know that geese fly in these V formations. The head goose has the most friction, the most tiring role of all the other team members. So they take turns. So the goose at the apex of that triangle will shift and be replaced by another goose who moves into that position. So here we have a team where members are, let's say, cross-trained. They're cross-trained to take on the same roles as other geese, but they take the burdens in different ways, and they share the burdens so that the whole flock can survive. So maybe you recognize one of the groups that you've worked in, but these sorts of descriptors help us understand what factors may be important in human groups. How can we emulate some of the things that come so naturally to other animals? So collective intelligence, does it actually happen in real groups of people? So the two questions that I'll talk about today is, does collective intelligence actually exist in human groups? And a corollary might be, do smarter members make smarter groups? The research on so-called collective intelligence, if I think about it more as a metaphor than an actual construct or measure, there are a lot of things that we study in the groups literature, a lot of theories that we have in the groups literature that really are all about how do we make teams greater than the sum of its parts. So if we think about collective intelligence as the glue that really creates a team that's better than any one of the members individually or even collectively could be, because they coordinate, because they collaborate, then that's the kind of performance gains that we can hope to get in real teams. Some of you may have studied teams in your business school if you went there, or maybe in your master's program. You might also know this phenomenon as synergy, or maybe something that's been around for a long time, the term process gain. And you might get from this name that groups can work together to actually gain value, meaning that they're greater than the sum of its parts, but they can also have process losses. So there are some tasks for which groups really aren't suited at all, where working together is actually creating lower performance. And most of the time that is because we're not attentive to each other, or because the coordination demands, especially in big teams, are so great that we fail to coordinate and we get something that is less than the sum of its parts. The reason I wanted to talk about collective intelligence as it's being researched is because this is a really novel way for us to study team performance and behavior. And Anita Woolley and Tom Malone suggested that we might study team collective intelligence the way we study individual intelligence. So if you've ever taken an IQ test, this is a measure of individual intelligence. But the IQ test is not a brain probe that tells you how smart you are. It's not, feeling the size of your brain that tells us about your intelligence. The only way we can score or understand IQ, which is abbreviated as G in the psychological literature, is by asking you other types of questions. So asking you mechanical types of questions, questions about spatial ability, questions about your numerical ability and your verbal skills. And the way that the test works is it posits that someone who is very good at all of those things is going to be more intelligent, have a higher IQ. So a person who scores well on all of those different types of tasks would have high G. And G is not measured directly, but it's measured indirectly through other questions, through other activities, through other different types of questions. And this is what Anita Woolley and Tom Malone tried to work on. Can we say that if a team performs a variety of tasks and they perform well on all those tasks, can we say that that group is more collectively intelligent? And the way that they tried to do that is by giving teams lots of different types of tasks, understanding whether there was a common factor that explained why some teams are able to do those tasks better than others, and then they tried to relate that common factor to other outcomes of interest. And I'll explain a little bit more what that means. So through a lot of their studies, this is on hundreds and hundreds of teams, they're up to thousands and thousands of teams at this point, they found that teams that were given a battery of tests and performed well on a significant proportion of those tests, let's call that C for collective intelligence, also performed on other tasks better than teams with lower C. For example, teams that were given the battery of tests and were working on online games actually performed better on online games if they had higher collective intelligence. And this is interesting because these are distributed systems where the members aren't even seeing each other. They found that performance on a Lego type task is improved if members are more collectively intelligent. And finally, they found that collective intelligence measured at the beginning of a semester in an MBA program is predictive of that team's performance later in the semester. So 15 weeks later. So this is, so far they're looking at these results thinking, this is great, this is working as you might expect individual intelligence to work. So they're getting very excited about this at this point. A slide that helps bring this home a little bit is they wanted to know to what extent does this collective intelligence thing, this C, predict performance on some of these tasks relative to individual intelligence. So on the x-axis here, you've got study one, which was performance on the video game. So the distributed teams that were working on an online game. And what they found is that the collective intelligence score mattered way more than other variables in predicting performance or team performance on the video game. It predicted way better than the average of individual members' intelligence. And it predicted way better than the smartest person on the team. So this gave them, again, some insights that it's not really the intelligence of the members that matters. It's what the members do together that makes them more collectively intelligent. So as scientists, we typically don't stop there. We want to know, well, what makes collective intelligence happen? So these researchers also looked at what are the predictors of collective intelligence. And one of the things that they looked at was member intelligence, which we saw was not nearly as strong a predictor as collective intelligence. Not the usual things that we try to measure in groups research, and maybe you've measured it too. How satisfied is the team? How motivated are my team members? To what degree does the team feel like a team and want to work together? Cohesion. But none of those things predicted team performance as well as collective intelligence. Not even personality traits. So we're often told that we should choose team members based on personality. Actually, that's not true. But the set of personalities that you have also did not do a very good job predicting performance relative to collective intelligence. One thing did, however, and it's this. So usually when I'm in a live audience, people are like, what? What's happening? What? So this is a very surprising and interesting result. So all of the things that we typically measure with, team science did not predict performance, but the proportion of women in these groups did predict collective intelligence and ultimately performance. So this was a result. It was published in Science. It got picked up by all the big newspapers, Wall Street Journal, New York Times. Anita Woolley was interviewed on NPR. This, of course, is a very provocative result, and the titles or the headlines were equally provocative. You want to make smarter teams, get more women. That was the kind of message that the media was putting out. And I felt a little sorry for Anita Woolley, because in every interview she had to say, wait. It's not the presence of women, or it's not the women's gender that's making a difference. It must be what the high proportional female teams were doing. So they looked a little deeper and tried to understand, so what's different about these teams than teams that are more proportionally male than female? And here's what they found. They found that teams where there was a higher proportion of women also scored higher on a certain test, which I'm showing you an example of, which is described as social sensitivity. So this is a test created by Simon Baron Cohen that shows respondents pairs of eyes, and there are 36 pairs of eyes in this test. And the respondents are meant to describe what emotion the pairs of eyes are showing. So this idea of, can you read people's facial expressions comes into play here. And you might test yourself. So if you look at these pairs of eyes, would you say that they're creating or showing an emotion that's playful, comforting, irritated, bored? You can guess for yourself. In this case, the right answer is playful. So it turns out that across 36 of these pairs of eyes, women typically score about 4 points higher than male respondents. So that by itself could explain the finding that a higher proportion of women in the group higher collective intelligence. Why? Because they also were better at reading people's faces. Now, this is a result that's a little bit perplexing, because I already told you that collective intelligence in online groups also was predicted by some of these things. And what they've since determined is it's not so much reading facial cues, it's more about being attentive to other members. So sort of like the sheep. So it's not just facial cues, it's how attentive, how responsive you are to other members, and how much you pay attention to members and pay attention to tasks. So that's a little update from this research. There was another thing that was more common in groups where there were more women than more men, and that was this. In groups where there was a higher proportion of women, the speaking turns were more distributed, more even. So there weren't a lot of airtime hogs, let's say, or people who dominated the discussion and left maybe other people quiet. So teams where there were more women, they were more successful at making sure everybody got a say, everybody's inputs were considered, and this was the reason that those teams performed better. So you don't have to be a female in order to gain the benefits of this kind of work, but some of the things we learned from this is more attentive members to the task, and processes that allow more people to contribute are likely to be higher in collective intelligence and higher performing as well. So this is an example of our research that maybe can filter down to practice and advice that we can give managers. And I'll speak about that for the rest of the time today. So one takeaway is don't assume that by assembling smart members, you're going to get a smart team. In fact, some of the research suggests that assembling teams of experts gets you a low-performing team. And you can imagine perhaps why that might be. So smart people don't make smarter teams. It's more about how those smart people interact together that makes the smarter team. And there are ways through communication interventions to make sure that even people who maybe aren't naturally attentive to nonverbal cues or attentive to others can ask questions and provide information such that they're getting the same sorts of information that people who can read other people are getting. So you can bootstrap that social sensitivity, that attentiveness in lots of ways. You know that we have other challenges in tech. Other than working in teams, which is always hard, we've got a diversity challenge in tech. And one of the major diversity challenges that I and my colleagues have been working on is the diversity challenge of gender. And the US government has put out a nice report through the EEOC that looks at women in tech. And these are some of the numbers. This is from 2016. So the question that we hear a lot is, well, isn't it a pipeline problem? We don't have enough women. And it's sometimes true, but not always. So it's perhaps partly a pipeline problem, because only 18% of people earning degrees are earning degrees in engineering and computer science. Other examples of a reason for the low percentage of women in tech is that we can't find enough of them with the right experience. Well, that may be true. Women are in high proportions in professions in general, but only 26% in computer-related occupations. One of the other explanations has a much more robust set of findings, and that is that one of the big problems is retaining women. So 56% of women leave tech jobs by mid-career, 2 times the rate of men. So these women are not going up in the ladder, which has downstream effects, and they're leaving the organizations, and sometimes leaving the organizations to start their own. So here we have a scenario where more women are earning college degrees, the percent of women in technology, and especially in other male-dominated fields, is shrinking at the same time. So what can we do about this? And some of the literature on diversity and gender helps us maybe understand why this might be. This is research done by Joan Williams and her colleagues, and they had a report that was looking at gender and racial bias in engineering, and one of their conclusions is that 41% of the scientists, the engineers and computer scientists, are working at very low levels in the organization. Being promoted, they're not staying. And what are some of the reasons for this? And this is what the respondents told them. Is that the culture is inhospitable to me. A second is isolation. I was talking with an area firm, I was talking with their women's group, and one of the female engineers raised her hand and she said that she was the only engineer among 40 other systems engineers, and that she felt isolated, which is not surprising if you're the only one. There are 2 others that maybe are more associated with stereotypical roles of women versus men. So in a lot of high tech, especially in Silicon Valley, where there are these, 24-hour hackathons, or you've got, scrum meetings that are in the middle of the night, these sorts of things can tend to disadvantage women who may have different types of obligations at home. Unfortunately, it's still the case that women have more of that burden than men. And finally, the lack of advancement, the lack of career opportunities as women are hopefully promoted through the organization just aren't there. So this is a reason that perhaps we're having trouble getting female leaders in tech. I always wonder, how is it that we got here? I was a computer science major in the 80s, and at that time there were about 50% of women got computer science degrees and were hired in those numbers. So I didn't really observe some of these problems that exist today. And these problems also didn't exist in, hold yourself here, in 1967. So I love magazine and this article basically says that, hey, there's this new job role that women are really suited for. Juicy bits here in a larger readable bubble here. So if you would also pay attention to who this quote is from, this is from Dr. Grace Hopper, who we all love in computer science. And what Grace Hopper suggests is that it's just like planning a dinner. So this is programming. It's just like planning a dinner. You have to plan ahead and schedule everything so it's ready when you need it. Programming requires patience and the ability to handle detail. Women are naturals at computer programming. So here you have Grace Hopper basically setting out the KSAs, the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to perform well in programming roles. And she's basically saying, and women have been doing this for a long time in their households, and they are ideally suited for this kind of work. And the pay was pretty good. So how do we get from this to what we see today? Okay. There are some insights from the diversity research that give us a little bit of information. And here, as we talk about these things, I ask you to be very curious about why these things happen, rather than feeling like we're all doing something wrong and there's so many things we could do better. I think that some of this is so interesting that it happens at all. And we have to thank our diversity researchers for helping to unpack, not just that it happens, but why it happens. So some of the ahas that we have from the diversity research that impinges directly on team behavior is we make assumptions about what people know and what people ought to know. So Andrea Hollingshead did a study where she asked males and females to partner together on a memory task. And she asked them to look at a series of categories of words to memorize. And the categories were things like automotive information, cuisine, sports, 5 or 6 different categories. And what she found is that both the males and the females, when partnered together, would divide the labor for learning words in very stereotypical ways. So let's say the female would specialize in learning words about cuisine, and the male would specialize in learning words about automotive repair. So they divided the labor in that way along stereotypical lines without thinking about what actual knowledge individuals had. So if the male in that pair actually had been a sous chef for 15 years, then dividing the labor on the basis of stereotypes would make very little sense, and you would get lower performance as a result. You get these knowledge holes where nobody was learning anything because we were assuming somebody would learn something else. Other research suggests that women feel a great need to explain or to show that they're competent, and this is typically because there's an assumption that we start out as less competent than our male counterparts. But demonstrating competence in a very confident way can sometimes backfire. And the research suggests that we don't like it so well when women actually assert their competence. It actually makes us like them less. And finally, women tend to be evaluated in performance evaluations, for example, on style things, like is she a team player, or she's very bossy, she's very interested in people, not in things, rather than the substantive kinds of performance metrics that might get you a promotion, for example. So we're just starting to look at materials like performance management surveys and documents that suggest new ways that we could actually monitor performance management and what we say about women, men in all demographic categories. Are we talking about the same performance differently? And if so, can we correct that before we make decisions like promotion decisions? We assign different roles differently, as I mentioned before, but there's also something else that happens, and that is women take on and volunteer for more what we might call housework jobs in teams. They're the ones taking the notes. They're the ones who might volunteer to bring the food. They might volunteer or be asked to set up a conference, for example, whereas the men tend to take on more what we might call glamour work, which is work that is much more a straight line to the goals and the values of the organization. So glamour work you might think of as skill building or knowledge building roles that actually will get you noticed and promoted. Whereas these housework roles, you could say, well, we need those for the team to be cohesive. But again, the fact that more women volunteer for those or are asked to do those is a problem, because we never see then the substance. We only see these sort of non-essential roles being done. So here's a cartoon that illustrates something related to that. I'll read it to you. So this is Miss Triggs is the only woman in a room of 5 other men. They're having a meeting, and one of the men says, "That's an excellent suggestion, Miss Triggs. Perhaps one of the men here would like to make it." So we have this problem of, in groups, we often don't hear everybody's inputs. And if we hear inputs, we might attribute them to the wrong person. And this is the case with Miss Triggs. The research suggests that men interrupt more in meetings, they participate more in meetings, and they're getting encouragement to do that. So of course they would continue. And just the opposite is true of women. And there's some really interesting writing by Ben Barres, who was the chair of the neurobiology department at Stanford, and he wrote this: "By far the biggest difference is that people treat me with far more respect. I can even complete a whole sentence without being interrupted by a man." Ben Barres transitioned to Ben from Barbara Barres. Barbara Barres was also a scientist, in fact, the same scientist, and he transitioned in the late 90s. So here we have an example that we rarely see in our research, somebody who has experienced 2 different ways of interacting socially, even though the person's intellect, behavior is probably very similar. So this question of invisible contributions keeps popping up in Teams research. And here's some more evidence of why that might be. So women appear to be less influential even when they actually possess expertise. When there are mixed gender teams, women tend to get less credit for successes, but they're blamed more for failures. And male success tends to be more likely attributed to skill, and female success more likely attributed to luck or hard work or the team itself. And there are process interventions that we've learned about that can help. So one is establish those norms for even speaking terms. Anyone can do this. Limit the amount of time that one or more airtime hogs have. You can do this very explicitly. Thank you, Steve. I want to hear from some others now. You could have little rules, for example, like you can't speak twice before everyone's had a chance. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. You can also appoint someone who's tracking interruptions. Maybe this is a neutral third party who's in the back of the room and just writing down what those interruptions are, who interrupted whom, and how often. And then just show the data. Because if you show the data and people see that they've been interrupting very many times during the meeting, they may not be aware of this. This might change their behavior. Another trick is to assign people to speak and report on different things before the meeting. And in so doing, you legitimize the speaking up of every person. You legitimize the speaking up of maybe a low status person who would ordinarily stay quiet. Why? Because they have a legitimate reason to exchange knowledge, to give information to the team. So if you think about the kinds of ways to compose teams, a lot of the research may be surprising. So of course you need people who have the requisite expertise. And we know that when there's diverse expertise, you can get higher performance and higher innovation. But you also get a lot of communication difficulties that have to be managed. What about personality? It's not true that all extroverts are better teams or all anythings are better teams. Really the variety is what matters. So introverts and extroverts make great team members. It turns out that introverts, although they might not say much, they do a lot of the work. There are big picture people or more detail-oriented people, and you really need both in your team. So if you were all big picture people, then no one would get down to the actual implementation. If you were all detail oriented, you might never, or you might lose sight of the overarching goal. So having both to balance is great. And my favorite, worriers and non-worriers. The worriers are great at finding problems in solutions, because they might think it's never going to work, this isn't going to happen. What are all of the reasons that this won't work? And then there are non-worriers who might be like, oh, everything's fine, everything's going to be great. So you really need both. You need risk assessment that the worriers are very good at, and you need positive vibes as well, which perhaps the non-worriers are good at. And finally, demography. We talked a little bit about gender diversity, but it's true that people from underrepresented groups also make great team members, but it's more difficult if they're the only one in the group. And having more than one minority person in the group is a great advantage. Okay, so I'll end with 3 other categories of pieces of advice. So this cartoon illustrates that coordination, collaboration is really important. Okay. So these are some of the key things that really make teaming hard. Big status differences in groups. If you've got the boss and the minions, then the minions are very unlikely to talk. So huge status differences in organizations create a lot of problems. So as managers and leaders, if you can reduce the negative effects of status differences, then you're much better off. You have more rich exchange of knowledge because everybody's speaking, and you're also more likely to really investigate the issues of the problem rather than attempting, or rather than assuming, oh, we all agree because obviously the boss agrees. The second is goal differences. So when you have people with different goals, then they're in conflict. So one person might be trying to get a promotion, another person might be trying to learn something new, another person might be trying to finish the project so they can go on to their new job. All of these things create situations where it's very hard to cooperate. And conflict, types of conflict that are really bad are the types of conflict that are personal as opposed to task-oriented. So some ways to reduce status differences is make the assumption everybody's got something to provide in the team, and we need to hear from everyone. There's interesting research that suggests that teams will tend to look at or make eye contact with the people that they think are high status. So if you're one of those leaders, make sure you look at everybody in the team. Rotating that housework and glamour work. Instead of asking for volunteers, say, we're going to take turns, and every 3 months we're going to change who takes the notes. Members of underrepresented groups, women, can amplify each other's comments so that it's more sticky in our brains that Lisa made that good comment. Miss Triggs had the idea. So if we keep saying, Miss Triggs, I really like that idea you provided, and now let's build on it, we've tagged Miss Trigg with the ideas, and then 2 months later, when we think about how great the idea is, Miss Trigg pops to mind. Tackling goal differences. One of the best ways to do this is to create what's called a superordinate goal. This is a goal for the whole team. And if you have a goal for the whole team that is always visible, maybe like a checklist, maybe the values of the team, the mission of the team, the mission of the project, this goal then becomes the big goal, and other people's goal becomes sort of demoted in their goal hierarchy. And finally, tackling things like conflict. Conflict about the task is okay because you're getting facts out, and that can be very helpful. But those kinds of discussions can also escalate. If the same person keeps telling you your facts are wrong, you might start to get a little ticked off. So you need also trust. And so thinking about managing conflict requires you think about the overarching goal of the group. How do you frame problems as collaboration, something that we need all the members for, not just a few? Managers can model behavior by showing that it's safe to disagree, it's safe to speak up, and we can create more of a trusting environment by having team members work together in different contexts. So there's more and more evidence that face-to-face team meetings are much better than virtual meetings. And I'm sorry, we're having one right now. So I'm going to end there. And it's true, teams are very, very powerful. Diverse teams are more innovative, but they require different types of management skills that can be learned. And of course, the big win that you want is something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So thank you very much. And if we have a little time for questions, I'd like to take those.
I have one question on Slack already, but Yvonne, I don't know, this is Matt. Do you have some questions out there in Zoom as well? Because I have one on Slack already. Well, without the questions from Zoom, I'm going to start with this one. Anne from UCSB says, does the effectiveness of the team depend on the purpose of the task? By way of example, she says, sports teams are the biggest example. Most have no women, but are very successful. What is the best way to match a team with the task?
So the best way to match a team with a task, and this is an interesting question, is by first looking at expertise or skill. So I always start there. And if you're having trouble finding underrepresented minorities or people of different genders or from different parts of the world, finding that talent, then the answer is not pick one of them and put them on the team. The answer is go look for more of them. So thinking about the knowledge and the skills is really foremost, and thinking about the members that have those skills would then be secondary, but it's still going to be difficult to coordinate. So if you're the only female football player on a mixed gender football team, life is going to be strange. So the coach needs to work a little harder to make sure that that person is integrated, able to use her talents in a way that helps the team, and vice versa.
Next question from Zoom. Do teams made up, this is from Peter Weber, do teams made up of all or almost all females perform higher than teams made up of men and women with a higher percentage of women? I can read it again if you like.
No, that's a very good question. So that person is getting to, is the relationship a curvy linear one where all men is not so great, all women's not so great, and something in the middle is way better on the side of more women? And that is in fact the case. So the findings from the collective intelligence literature is that teams that were somewhat mixed but had a higher percentage of women performed better than teams of all women. So it's not just the gender, it's what the people do.
Next question, do you have any suggestions? This is from John Ruzicka from UCOP. Do you have any suggestions for team building when the teams capitalized have to be virtual, people who work off-site, different locations, et cetera, where it's highly unlikely you will meet in person?
Yes, that is a real challenge. And when I work with engineering teams, they're working across the world, different time zones. So there are lots of fault lines that can really create coordination problems in these sorts of teams. And I would suggest that teams like that meet in person at least every so often. So maybe at the first part of the project, so project launch, definitely at the end, project debriefing, and ideally sometime in the middle. So if you can get people together in the same room, you get so much benefit from it. And then your virtual communications are more informed by these collective intelligence moves where you feel like you know how someone's going to react, you know how somebody's going to behave in advance of actually observing that behavior. So there really isn't a great way to say virtual teams can be as good. It is the case that virtual teams are much harder to create collective intelligence in, and face-to-face meetings are sometimes needed.
So we have time for one more question from Edie Bartolo. Thanks again, Laura, for helping us out. In work, why is it important to be liked rather than be appreciated for our abilities and skills?
It's a good question. Being liked is often unrelated to team performance, which is the good news. The problem is in how we're then evaluated later. So if you're disliked, then the chances that you'll be evaluated on your style or how likable you are is much greater than if you're evaluated on the actual content or your knowledge or skills. So liking can get in the way of our perceptions or our evaluations of people. So it may not affect the team process directly in the moment, but it will affect our perceptions in retrospect as we try to understand how high a performer is she. If we don't like her, we're much less likely to give a higher performance rating. So that's where it comes into play.
Dr. Lewis, thank you. And the last question was, are we going to make these slides available for people offline? Would you mind sharing the slides?
Yes, we'll do that.
So yeah, Matt, let me jump in. So we do have the slides available for everyone, and hopefully in the slides there's also a contact point for Dr. Lewis if people have follow-up questions. Dr. Lewis, on behalf of the IT community across the University of California, which is the campuses and the medical centers, thank you so much for your time today and your insights. This topic, both elements of effective teaming and then the diversity of teams, is so relevant to what we're trying to do here. Most of our works in the IT field is made up of teams. And whether it's being effective in teaming at one location or working in teams across multiple locations, we have a very active dialogue that I know you're aware of just in terms of the diversity of our organization. Just some great insights here. We appreciate so much you taking the time to share them with us today.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. All right. So then we're going to just a couple more minutes. We're going to just move real quick, just remind people of a couple of things and a couple of quick stories, and then let you on your way. So last time we were together, we talked about the True North initiative, which is kind of our strategic plan or direction setting for the CIOs and the overall IT organization. Within then, we talked about really three priorities that Matt Hall talked about last time. And, we spent a lot of time the last time the CIOs were together about cloud strategy. Shout out to UC Santa Cruz, who spent a good amount of time talking about their enterprise systems migration to AWS. And, the CIOs were riveted at asking a lot of questions about how they did that with their student system and their financial system, because we're all heading in that direction, and really appreciate Santa Cruz sharing their lessons learned with the organization. We talk a lot about cyber, so everybody knows about our activities there. And then labor workforce strategies, this has been an ongoing conversation now coming up on a year. Last year at UCSB, CIOs held a roundtable to talk about it, and we've got some very interesting pilots at different campuses in terms of really evolving, dealing with labor challenges and workforce challenges. And I know a lot of CIOs are going to be at UCSB this year and probably talking more about what they've been doing for the last year on this. Slides go, there we go. On the IT community. So the community continues to grow and advance. It's really been great. And I just always like to throw statistics in here just to demonstrate how much of the organization we're starting to loop in and really build on that concept of collective intelligence by giving people the opportunity to connect and a fabric for how to communicate and collaborate. You can see that Slack is now coming up on 4,000 people. We're at that time of year where we're setting goals for the next 12 months and trying to really look at these three metrics and the use of the portal and really set our goals for next year in terms of growth of more and more people in the community. We need everyone's help. If for people who are not using Slack or maybe don't know about the blog, get them connected in. We've got mechanisms here. We've got people here at Office of the President who really are here to really help grow our community and get more people connected in. All right, Slack, almost 4,000 members. I'm actually going to a conference, a healthcare conference tomorrow, and we're talking about these. Some of these slides come right out of the presentation there, because people are very interested in the community building activities that we've engaged in here at the University of California and the success that we're having. The portal, which we launched at UCSB last year, we were just looking at the metrics for the first time in terms of driving activity to the portal and where they click to go to, whether it's to the blog, or you can see we're starting to get more and more of the campuses and the medical centers to give us information about their upcoming events, so that you can see One IT Summit at Berkeley is happening this week. Women in IT conference happening at UCLA. Give us your event so we can represent them here, so the total community can know about them and maybe even connect in. Last year, we highlighted a hackathon that San Diego Health ran, but there were several other medical centers across the system and even Berkeley campus where people participated into that. So great ways to keep connecting people. Obviously, I think a lot of people know about the blog, but again, we're only at 1,600 people subscribed to the blog. We know we have a subset of people who are maybe going to the blog through the portal, but we want to get the message out there. And of course, we want to hear your stories, right? One of the great things about the blog is the articles are coming from the community. They're not being picked or written by the people here at Office of the President. They're coming from all of you. And slides. Why do we always have problems advancing slides over here? Okay. With that, we're pretty much out of time. But do we have any questions from the audience overall? No?
Not in chat yet.
Okay. All right, then to close. Again, I want to thank Dr. Lewis for her time today and her inspirational messages to us. Two, I hope to see all of you at UCSB in August in Davis. I got a great agenda going on there. Don't miss, for the first time, we've got a Women in IT track throughout the conference, and really encourage people to attend and be a part of that conversation. EDUCAUSE is coming up in the western part of the U.S. in Denver in late October. I hope to see a lot of people there, and that we do a great job representing the UC at that event. And as always, thank you for all the work that you do, and let's do more together. Signing off here from Oakland. Have a good summer, everyone.